I want to welcome you to our fourth prison experience. Today we're going to talk about the prison of His power. It's found in Acts chapter 12. So if you'll turn that way, we'll get started. Because what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about how it's in those prisons of life sometimes we find ourselves in. And we've talked about all different kinds of prisons that people can find themselves in. For example, we know they can find themselves in the prison of some kind of bitterness, some kind of vengeance, some kind of anger, can't seem to get out. They can find themselves in some kind of prison of an addiction, whether it be drugs or alcohol or porn or gambling or shopping or whatever it might be, or food, that we find ourselves in different kinds of prisons. But the thing we're going to learn this morning is simply this, and that is it's in those prison times that God can show forth His power. That His power is on display in a great way when we see Him act when we're inside those prisons. For example, how many of you have ever known through the years growing up, and you'd have this guy and he'd have a tremendous religious experience. You maybe you grew up with him, you've known him for a long time, and he was the worst of the worst. I mean, he was the scandalous of the scandalous. He was the bad of the bad. But then all of a sudden you see that in whatever prisons that were around him, that God did something very powerful because God changed his heart. So it's in those prisons sometimes that we see God's power more than any other time. So what we're going to do today is as we look at Acts chapter 12, is we're going to see the story of the early church. And the early church is booming. The early church is exceeding all expectations. The early church is having all kind of successes. They're growing in numbers. They're growing in spirit. They're growing in community. They're just doing a tremendous spurt of growth. But then, even though the church is growing, we always also know that where there is growth on the one end, there are those who want to stop that growth and suspend that growth and end that growth on the other end. There's always those around who don't want to see God's kingdom grow. In fact, you see them outside the church, but believe it or not, they're also inside the church. That where a church becomes so political and a church becomes so organized that people set it up for it to become kind of their own empire, their own thing that they run. God's not in it anymore, and they hinder kind of anything that would bring new folk in, because if new folk come in, that's going to be a threat to what they have and what they're doing. So we see on every kind of scope that there are times when what happens is that there are those enemies, those that try to stop the growth of the church. So here's what we're going to see today. We're going to see an old familiar story, and it's a story that takes place in a prison. It's a story that involves Peter. So as you turn there in Acts chapter 12, let's just see what it's talking about and see how we can relate that to everybody in this place right now. So the first thing we see in Acts chapter 12 I want to talk about is that God's power is seen in His peace. Now, when you look at verse 6, you see something very important in that verse, because the Bible says there, the night before Herod was to bring him to trial, Peter was sleeping between two soldiers bound with two chains, and sentries stood guard at the entrance. Now, when you think about that and think about the situation Peter finds himself in, you find that, first of all, that he is sleeping between two soldiers. Got a soldier on one side, a soldier on the other side. But not only he's sleeping between two soldiers, he's also bound with two chains. I mean, he's probably got one on the left, one on the right. Probably the hands and the feet are both connected, so you can kind of envision what's going on. He's laying there in that bed, two soldiers on each side, and he is bound. His arms, his feet, his hands, they're bound. I mean, he can't do a whole lot. So he's sleeping between two soldiers, bound within two chains, and then if all that were to fail, if he could pull a Houdini, if all that could fail, then outside the gate, outside the entrance, there stood two more guards. Man, this guy right here is in an impossible situation. If he's ever going to get out of that prison, it is pert near impossible for him to ever be able to escape that. I mean, just try to envision it. I mean, there he is. He's sleeping between two prisoners, two guards. You know, they were big old muscular, big. I mean, they wasn't wimps. They were secure in what they were. I mean, they had it going on. So, and then the chains. I mean, these were wrought, these were made by these ironsmiths, and they were there, and I mean, you can't get out of those chains. And then even the event that he was able to, he's still got 2 guards on the outside just waiting for him to try to escape, because then they're going to take care of him. It is an impossible situation. You know, in America, they have the prison, the super prisons out in Colorado. You know, that it is supposed to be the most secure prison in all the world. You can't get out of that thing. It is impossible to escape. Well, that's kind of where Peter was. I mean, in our mind, in our eyes, it is impossible for him to get out. Another key thing to note here is it's talking about how he's being kept, but it's talking about how the night before Herod was to bring him to trial, in that day, it's different than in America today. In that day, if you stood trial and you were found guilty, your punishment would begin when? Right there. You found guilty of treason, or you found guilty of blasphemy, or you found guilty of whatever it might be, if you were given that sentence, for example, Peter, more than likely found guilty, is going to be sentenced to death. There was not a series of appeals that everybody could go through. Right there, you're guilty. Okay, let's go out there and take his head off. It's over, it's done. So here's the great thing. He's in that prison. There's no way for him to get out. Humanly, it is impossible for him. There's no way he can escape. The second thing is, it is the night before he's supposed to stand trial, and when he stands trial and he knows he's going to be found guilty, when he stands trial, he's going to be instantly executed. But here's the great thing about God's peace. Because the Bible tells us there, the night before Herod was to bring him to trial, he was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and sentries stood guard at the entrance. But then also we know that the Bible tells us something about what was going on, is in verse 7, suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side, and he did what? He woke him up. Now, I don't know about you, but if I had somebody tell me tomorrow about noon you're going to die, I might be a little anxious. So here he is. It should be a situation where he would never be able to find any kind of security, any kind of peace, any kind of comfort. But there in that prison, he is asleep. Now, that tells you something about the peace of God that passes what? All understanding. Because there's no way you can understand a man in that kind of situation being able to sleep at night. Physically, how can he do that? Spiritually, emotionally, how can he do that? But here we know that God's peace. Have you ever been in a time where you think, man, you ought to be the most anxious, torn up, messed up person on the planet, but somehow God gave you a peace? Didn't know how you was going to pay the bills, but somehow God gave you peace. Spouse done walked out the door, but somehow God gave you peace. Somebody you love just died, but somehow God gave you peace. Okay? So that's the first thing we see. In that prison sometimes we learn about peace. We learn that God gives peace. Let's go to the next thing. So, God's power is seen in His peace. Then secondly, God's power is seen in His presence, going down into verse 7a. We already read that. Because as He's there, as He's sleeping, who shows up? An angel shows up. Now, have you ever thought about the fact that, have you ever been in a situation where you think, well, God can never find me. God will never be able to do anything for me. I mean, I am so far out. What in the world can He do? Well, His presence is shown in this way. Because if the angel was able to wake him up, that means the angel had to get to where he is. And for the angel to get where he is, the angel had to get by what? Guards. Okay? So it's almost like we learn that God will turn every kind of mountain. God will do whatever He has to do in order to be in the presence of His people when they need Him. God can move mountains to make that happen. For example, what do we know about a few of these characters? Because we know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were thrown into what? They were thrown into the... But when they went, somebody was already in there, waiting on them to come in. Who was that? That's Jesus. All right, waiting on them to come in there. When you think about Daniel, and Daniel gets ready to go into the lion's den, and he goes in there, but who's already there? Already there. Even Noah, God didn't say to go into the ark, but he said to come into the ark because he's already in there. Whenever we get ready to go through a tough time, a prison of life, and when those times come, he promises he will always be there with us. In fact, he goes out ahead of us. He's in front of us. He knows what's going on. He knows what's happening. So here we see Peter. There's the power of his peace. He's sleeping like the baby. There's the power of his presence. I mean, in impossible circumstances, God makes sure that he shows up, that he's there. Every trial, every mile of every trial, he's always there. Have you ever sensed his presence, and it just gave you, because all this kind of circles and all it comes together, because sometimes when we sense his presence, we sense his peace. We know he's right there with us. In fact, when you were growing up as a kid, and you got kind of scared, kind of afraid, I mean, who came to you that brought you peace? Parents. We have those people who come along our path. When something happens, we know who we can run to, you know, because that presence is comforting, you know. So God's power seen in his presence, God's power seen in his peace, and then God's power is also seen in his providence. Look at starting in verse 7. We're going to read a little bit. Suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him up. "Quick, get up," he said, and the chains fell off Peter's wrist. Then the angel said to him, "Put on your clothes and sandals," and Peter did so. "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." And the angel told him. Peter followed him out of the prison, but he had no idea what the angel was doing was really happening. He thought he was seeing a vision. They passed the first and the second guards, came to the iron gate leading to the city. It opened for them by itself, and they went through it. When they had walked the length of one street, suddenly the angel left them. Then Peter came to himself and said, "Now I know without a doubt that the Lord sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches and from everything the Jewish people were anticipating." Now, how's God's power seen in his providence? Well, God moved was this normal stuff? No. God moved in supernatural power. And in the prison times of life, sometimes God will provide for us in supernatural power. It's not anything you can explain. It's not anything you can understand. It's not anything you can predict. The thing being, the biggest thing that happened was they passed through the first guard. Okay? He said, I guess, he might have been, go ahead. They got through the second guard. All right. Then they come to the iron gate leading to the city to get out. It's bolted up, locked down, chains, locks, everything around that gate. But then all of a sudden, what happened? The gate opens up. Physically impossible. Scientifically impossible. A gate that has chains and bolts and bars and locks and all around it, it can't just open up. But in God's providence, if he wants it to open, it'll open. That door is chained and locked. I mean, it's not going to open and let you out. It's not going to open and let you in. I mean, it is impossible. It'll never happen. But then all of a sudden, it falls into place. It takes place. You do get away from what you need to get away from, and you do find yourself where you want to be. And it happens supernaturally. You can't explain it. I mean, have you ever noticed how we try to explain away just about everything? We try to find an explanation for everything that happens. You know, it was just a coincidence, okay? Just a coincidence, it happened this way. No, it was a supernatural act of God's providence. Let's see, we know it happened in the Bible, but let's see, how does it happen in people's lives? You ever seen it happen in people's lives? You know, have you ever got a job you didn't think is ever going to get? I mean, you didn't really deserve it. It wasn't really, but you got it, you know. And you think, well, how did that happen? Somebody in an addiction. You ever know anybody like that? Oh my gosh, he's been drunk for 37 years. Then all of a sudden it's gone. You know what that was? That was God's Holy Spirit. That was supernatural power. Here we have Peter. You know, so now the angel's gone, and he's by himself. So let's see what happens in verses 12 through 17. When this had dawned on him. Have you ever had anything just dawned on you? You woke up one day and you thought, you know why that happened, and the reason that happened is because of God's intervention, God's supernatural power. God did something in my life. The God of the universe has got all kinds of stuff to worry about. He did something in my life. So Peter, then it dawned on him. You ever had anything dawn on you? You know? It's an aha moment. That light just goes off. Peter, it dawned on him. The reason the angel came into the prison and enabled his escape was because it dawned on him it was not just for the heck of it. It was for a purpose. All right, let's see what it is. Let's start in verse 12. When this had dawned on him, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered together and were praying. Peter knocked at the outer entrance, and a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer the door. When she recognized Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed, she ran back without opening and exclaimed, "Peter is at the door." "You're out of your mind," they told her. When she kept insisting that it was so, they said, "It must be his angel." Peter kept knocking, and when they opened the door, they saw him and were astonished. Peter motioned with his hand for them to be quiet and described how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. Now, do you think there's people that will doubt your explanation when God does something in your heart and in your life? Yeah. They'll try to explain it away with some kind of coincidence. In fact, the Bible says here, when Peter starts knocking on the door, some girl comes to the door and she sees him. Oh, that's Peter. But she doesn't open the door. She runs because the assumption of these people is Peter was to stand trial when? That morning. So by the time he comes to that house, they assume he's already dead. But he's knocking on the door, and it's Peter. And then what do they tell her? "You out of your gourd. You are crazy." But then they go and they finally realize, who is it? It's Peter. "Tell James and the brothers about this," he said, and then he left for another place. Now, as he was going from place to place, what do you think he was doing? Preaching. And he's telling what? He's telling that testimony. He's telling that story. Everywhere he's going, hey, I was in prison. I was about to be put to death. Now, I was at peace because I know to be absent from the body is to be present for the so I wasn't. But then this angel came, and the chains fell off, and these sleeping soldiers stayed asleep. I mean, I crawled over on top of them, and I had my knee in his stomach, and I had my foot on his head, but they never did even wake up. And I went out, and all of a sudden, the doors opened up, and I went outside. Then we came to the gates of the city, and it was locked down. Yeah, and they opened by themselves. But he keeps on telling the story because the story is true. Okay? So what was the purpose? The purpose was for him to tell that story. Okay? Now, what does that have to do with us? Well, what it has to do with us is simply that when things happen in our lives, when we know that God has intervened and shown us His peace, His power, His providence, we know there's a purpose in it. And one of the purposes in it is to tell the story. Yeah. Tell the story. Because you tell a story like that, that brings what? That brings more to Christ, brings hope to people. You know, and they're thinking, man, I'm in a prison too. I wish I could get out. Well, it happened to me. Did that bring some hope? You know? All right. Great. Thank you for being here.